Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to our, I like what Sterling has called it, the Be Better Club. Sterling, I have just taken that name and owned it, so I hope you don't mind.
I don't think I was the purveyor of the Be Better Club. Someone said it.
Okay, well,
Okay.
I like it. As you know, and George and Nikki, I'll have you introduce yourself in just a second. But I think, George, you've heard this last time, but I'll say it one more time. The purpose of this group is to be sort of ethics ambassadors across not only UCF, but our community at large. So this started out as the Ethics Ambassadors Network. And the network is not only these meetings, but also a chance for me to reach out to colleagues and graduate students across campus with ethics related news and interests. And you should feel free to use me as a resource too. So you're part of a network, whether you like it or not, and you can opt out at any time, of course. But more importantly, this Be Better Club that meets every week, every 2 weeks, I forgot where we stand, who knows, 2 weeks, I think, is a chance for us to talk about each other's interests in ethics. And so I sent out, you saw a list of sessions and topics that we'll go from. And again, as always, if people have other interests they'd like to talk about as part of the club, you should feel free to reach out to me and we can add sessions or reorganize things. But I'm really excited to just remind you that across the semester, with the exception of the last 2 sessions, they're all driven by you. I have lots of things to say, as always. It's what I do. Ethics and saying stuff. Saying stuff about ethics is what I do. But I really like that the research that you all are bringing to the table and the interests is what's going to drive these bi-weekly conversations. So I know we all know each other, I think, but Iona and Nikki, you weren't here with us last week, I think. So maybe you want to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your interests in ethics and how you came to find us and how you'd like to participate. So Nikki, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. And it's super lovely that you all do know each other, but maybe you could, everybody say a tiny bit for those of us who don't know you. I used to run events also, so we always started like that. So I am new to the TNT program, first year doctoral student. I come to that from many different avenues. My interest in ethics really started back in the 80s and 90s from a bioethics perspective and sort of threaded through me wandering off into the English and arts and humanities departments. And I was so excited to get to meet you, Jonathan, at the Grad Student Studies Fair. So that was super exciting. And the work that I'm doing now is really anchored in public history, which of course is, you know, the land of ethics, right? Restorative ethics, all kinds of, I mean, it's super rich, right? As far as like how we're working with people, how we're treating histories, how we reclaim and restore all of these voices that have been, you know, absented from the field for so long. So I'm thrilled that it's an actual area and not just something that people do on the side of their work. And I'm excited to learn more about what else is going on and how to serve that in the community.
Right on. Yeah, I was really interested, Nikki, when we first met, we talked a little bit about your bioethics background, and the shift to public history is fascinating to me. I'm really excited that you're here. So yeah, we'll try to contribute as best we can. Yeah, we should. I think, Nikki, you're right, of course. We should go around and do the thing. Does anybody want to go first? I can randomly pick on people. But
I could go ahead and go first.
Sure.
Yes, my name is George. My first session was actually last week, but I'm a first-year PhD student studying conservation genomics. So a lot of my interests are within like conservation, land management, protection of land, and ecology. But no, I thought it was a really good fit. It's just kind of in what I want to do as far as like applied land management and taking some of those like genomic tools that we have and thinking about like policy and also use of land by different entities. So there's a lot of just like overlap of little pieces of things that I always have questions about, and I think will be good to just have discussions on and think about with other people too.
Yeah, that's great. And I know one of our TNT colleagues set up a chat service that we can all contribute to too, if we get that up and running. And that way, George, like if you're thinking about things during the week and we don't have a regular meeting, you can reach out to the group and just say, hey, what do you think about this? And then we can all pitch in. You all will be much better about that than I am. I mean, I still have like a 1990s flip phone, so Lakelyn knows, obviously. But that's great. Yes, good to have you. Thanks, George.
Oh.
Go for it, Sterling. You're the man in
What's
the
that?
shadows.
Huh?
I said you're the
I'm
man
sorry?
in the shadows.
Oh, well,
No, you're good. You're good. Don't worry.
can you see behind me? I'm in Cancun. This is the first time I've used a laptop for this. So,
Oh, that's amazing.
yeah, I'm at a resort in Cancun, so I came in from the beach to have a Zoom meeting. Yeah.
That's dedication, Sterling. Thanks.
So, yeah, since I'm here, and I'll introduce myself. And so I'm always going to think of George in some sort of race car seat. Okay, George visits us in some sort of Recaro or some kind of race car seat. But
Yeah.
Nikki, when you said you met Dr. Beaver, yeah, he's hard to get away from once you meet him. He doesn't think of himself as being dynamic and have great magnetic personality, but he's hard to leave alone once you get talking to him. But
Really, I think you're describing me as kind of a stalker, Sterling. Like that. That's a little.
What's that?
Just follow you around. Like, yeah, thanks. Come on, Sterling.
Well, I'm glad you don't think I'm the stalker, so it all works.
So yeah, I was in science my whole life. I still am. 35 years as a laboratorian. I actually, and as Dr. Beaver knows, I'm now in a graduate program at Western Michigan University, spirituality, culture, and health. I would just say, and Dr. Beaver doesn't know this, when I had to send my transcripts, I didn't realize how lousy I was at science. When I looked at my grades from UCF, it was always the humanities and philosophy courses that I had excelled in, which were just superlative courses that I didn't need. And so here I am 30 years after my career started in the philosophy department and enjoying it. So yeah, I'm at Western Michigan University. I'm kind of focused on spirituality, faith, and healthcare outcomes. So as a clinical scientist, I've been in a healthcare setting for all 35 years. And so hopefully I'll be able to try to do some studies and that type of thing as far as spirituality goes with healthcare outcomes. It's really, they've had a lot of great measurements with psychiatric patients, but not so much physical healthcare outcomes. But that's kind of my interest, and that's where I'm at today. Yeah, that's it.
That's great. Thanks. Jose, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jose Vasquez. I am an employee here at the university. I work at the Office of Environmental Safety, and I have a master's degree in philosophy that I obtained a long, long time ago.
Thanks, Jose. Yeah, I'm really glad. I mean, I'm so grateful that everybody is continues to come. Jose was joining us in person when we were doing those pre-pandemic, and is still here. And I'm trying my best not to bore him. And those of you with philosophy backgrounds, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways in which, you know, applied ethics gets a bad rap. And sorry, Iona and Lakelyn, let me soapbox here for a second. But there's a way in which philosophy gets a bad rap because we tend to theorize, and that's specifically not what I intend to do in these sessions. We'll get to some theory and some support and evidence and epistemic constraints and all this fun technical stuff. But really what I want to do is make sure that we give each other space to think about ethics together. It's something that I think at the university is still lacking. There's a pretty big, as you all know, there's a pretty big sort of compliance infrastructure in place, which makes ethics feel like, you know, the short courses you take in web courses to bone up on how not to like screw up at the university, which is really, really important. But there's no space for these kind of discussions once we get past introductions. Anyway, okay, thanks for the soapbox. Iona, do you want to go ahead since you weren't with us last time?
Yes, hi. My name is Ioana Katsavia, and I'm a second year PhD student in early childhood education. My specialization is in gifted education, and I'm interested in ethics because I would like to combine them with gifted education activities in general. So I failed to attend your previous meetings because this time I have a class, and now I'm in 2 Zoom meetings. So I'm trying to combine still. I'm so happy that you record the meeting. So thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. And I'm really glad that in some ways the pandemic has given us a chance to do things like double dip in meetings. And I hope you take this as a secondary thing to your course, of course. But yeah, I will say, and I'll type his name here in the chat just for your benefit. But if you don't know Michael Burrows' work, Michael is a philosopher working in philosophy for children specifically. So he's a fascinating guy and a really sweet guy. He directs an ethics center out on the West Coast. But I've known him for quite a while, and his work is excellent. So if you're interested in especially philosophy and ethics for young students, he might be somebody's work who you could track down and read. And we can also try to drag him into one of these sessions to talk with us. I think he'd be willing to do that for us too. And that's the other thing. I'm just, sorry, Lakelyn, one more tiny soapbox. That's the other thing that you could lean on me for. So if there are voices you want to hear about ethics or topics or figures, I know a lot of people, and although they're not as attracted to me as Sterling seems to be for whatever good reason, I have a lot of friends, and I think it would be really fun to invite them to a session and just say, hey, talk with us about, philosophy for children. Like, what's that about? I think that would be fun for them and fun for us, and we could, post it on YouTube or something later on. Okay, so today's session is going to be led by Lakelyn Taylor, who I'll let introduce herself in just a second. I will say, just as a pre-introduction, Lakelyn and I don't even know how we met initially. You'll tell us.
I'll tell him because I remember.
Okay. But Lakelyn and I, over the summer, worked on 2 separate journal articles that we submitted. Both, one got quickly rejected and will be resubmitted soon, and the other's under review still. But they're really excellent projects. Okay, Lakelyn, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. As Dr. Beaver said, I'm Lakelyn Taylor. I am a second-year doctoral student in the Strategic Communication program through the Nicholson School of Communication and Media. So I do a lot of research looking at the intersection of risk and crisis and instructional communication through a lens of religion and ethics. So, and I take an interest in ethics because I think it's so core to who we are as like humanity and as human beings. I think it's hard to separate out and say that, ethics or morality or, whatever we would speculate of it is non-existent or separate from us. And so I think that in the social sciences and the human sciences, we should incorporate that into our literature. And in the risk and crisis literature specifically, there's not a whole lot of discussion or exploration into how ethics applies to how we are communicating during these times of risk and crisis and post-crisis. So that was important to me. And I met Dr. Beaver. I don't know, for those of you who are doctoral students, you may or may not know, but we have to all do like the academic integrity trainings. And there's 4 of them that we have to do. The very first one that I went to was actually hosted by Dr. Beaver, and was just a really engaging and super interesting presentation. And then at the end, he mentioned the new Center for Ethics that UCF had, and the like welcoming opening session thing that was happening the next day. And I was like, I like ethics. I am interested in this opening session of this center. So I went the next day to the opening session and then got to meet, talk with him a little bit more and, introduce myself and said, if I can help in any way, if I can be a part of this in any substantial way, like, please let me know, because I'm very interested in being a part of this movement, so to speak. And he has graciously not rejected that. He and has really just brought me on, and we did the 2 research projects together this summer, which I am forever in his debt for, and because it was a great experience, right? So to give you a little bit of an overview and to talk about the 2 research projects we did, I thought it was a really unique blend of both of our backgrounds and our research interests, because the reason why we split it into 2 articles, and Dr. Beaver, you can correct me if I say anything that is false, but for one article we took a more communication lens to it, which attended to my background and my literature knowledge and my what I could speak to more intellectually. So we did one through a communication lens, which we submitted to a communication journal that is specifically geared towards ethics, which is still under review. And then the other journal took more of a ethical philosophy, bioethic sort of framework, which we submitted to the Hastings Center, which did get rejected, but now we're submitting it to bioethics. Is that correct? So the project in totality looks at public commenting. So, as the digital age has ever increased and evolved and developed, and as we are as a society getting more into turning things to online platforms like teaching, like voting, like discourse, public forums pop up, and this is especially true in policymaking and rulemaking. We have now seen this sort of shift towards opening up rulemaking to public forums, so where people can come in, they can comment on a policy that is up for review or up for potentially being passed, and people can make either anonymous or non-anonymous comments related to that policy and their sort of attitudes, beliefs, expectations toward it. And this was especially evident in the case study that we chose to do, looking at the common rule, which was all about looking at definitions of vulnerable participants and biospecimens, and what constitutes, what is our definition of what needs to be protected in research, and what participants, what sorts of people or biospecimens again need to be protected when people go for IRB and things of that nature. And at the forefront, everyone thought that the rule was going to be passed a certain way, but based on the public comments that happened towards it, it actually got passed in a completely other direction. And so that was interesting to us to understand how these public comments can affect policymaking. And the ethical dilemma in all of this, right? The ethical lens that we chose to explore really is the ethics behind this anonymity, right? And the ethics behind the weight that we put on public comments, because we cannot always verify that these comments are made by the individuals that would be most affected by them. we cannot guarantee that these comments are not made by larger corporations or businesses or lobbyists who are wanting to exercise their power, privilege, and their will over these policies. And so we explored the ethics behind anonymity and non-anonymous comments, and sort of propose a solution that in order to maintain ethical discourse and an ethical policy making on a digital platform, we need to start looking at who is posting these comments in some way, whether it's through tracking the computer ISP number or through different means, which does not inherently guarantee that this solution is perfectly moralized and like all the ethical dilemmas are taken care of by any means, but it puts in place at least a step towards making it more ethical, as well as arguing that as policymakers, these rule makers and regulators need to ethically consider the weight that they're placing on these comments. It's okay to look through them and get sort of what they would call a consensus, but also acknowledging we don't really know where they're coming from. So how much weight can we really put on these comments? And so that's sort of the generalized overview of our papers and where we sort of took them. And I think going into the future, we can take these same sorts of concepts and apply them in other contexts, like social media posts or comments that are made on instructional videos, like what's going on with the COVID-19 crisis and all of the, when a government agency posts an instructional video about the virus, the public forum that ensues afterwards can affect how people perceive that crisis, which has ethical implications to it, especially on the bioethic front, I think. So, I would like to, I would like to hear all of your opinions too, as to where you think this research could lead, and, so that's essentially what we did for our summer projects, and I'm looking forward to getting reviewer feedback on it and getting all of your feedback as well.
Yeah, thanks, Lakelyn. And I'll add, it was such an interesting project to me because it was so interdisciplinary by its nature. It was a bioethics project combined with communication, combined with like federal policy and law. And I think that's why projects like that sometimes are challenging to place or get published in a specific journal. We got really good feedback from Hastings editors who said, yeah, this sounds like a really interesting project, but then they read it and they were like, it is really interesting, but like it doesn't seem to fit in the sort of work we normally publish. So here's some other suggestions. No worries. So anyway, yeah, I'm really excited about the project, and I'd love to just talk with you all and Lakelyn a little bit about the ethical issues involved, or why we chose to go in the direction we did, or how we got thinking about it, or things it might relate to in your own work. Go ahead.
Well, and that's something too that I think is really important in the articles that we wrote. Although there are challenges in placing the articles, my discipline, especially, I don't know about all of your disciplines, but the communication discipline has been recently stressing we're not interdisciplinary enough, right? Like we don't call in other disciplines when we're trying to construct risk and crisis messaging, or when we look at communication principles, and that's much to our detriment. And so I think that this project, that like these projects are a step toward that more interdisciplinary connectivity that I think is really important in academia. So thank you for mentioning that too.
Thoughts, comments, questions? I mean, I could talk for a very long time about the common rule for sure, but that might be something, Nikki, you know a little bit about from a bioethics background.
It's really so exciting. You must have this like in preprint somewhere, hopefully, eventually.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, another colleague and I published on the common rule ethics question we did over the summer. So that's in print. I can send you a copy.
Oh, nice.
And I have no trouble with this group reading as long as Lakelyn doesn't also, reading the draft. We don't have a preprint because it hasn't been accepted yet. But there's definitely a draft you can read with all the normal
I think that would be
caveats.
really exciting, especially like, you know, talking about work in general, to like even, you know, have some kind of collegial respect for that not yet being published. But I mean, I think like we probably all really love to like engage with it more deeply. But I used to do public involvement workshops for the DOT.
Yeah, really?
And
Okay.
super like landminey, right? Because nobody wants a highway in their backyard. The only people that are like able to fight against that are the wealthy and those that have time to go to meetings that take public comment, you know. But even in those like scenarios, we had to work so hard on exactly what you're talking about, like verifying residency, you know, that the people have like legitimate claim to be speaking up, which I also think is a weird ethical question, right? I mean, isn't, you know, humanity and breathing legitimate claim to speaking up? So yeah, it's really exciting to hear about what's possible digitally with like verifying that, and or attempting to verify it, and what other concerns that brings up in terms of like privacy and other kinds of tracking. I mean, we've been watching a Netflix show that like lets you choose your own path, and Netflix has been mapping that data, even though it might not really matter for the show, but they want to find out later if like somebody who chose like chocolate milk correlates with someone who doesn't pay their bill on time. You know, I mean, like really crazy. So in that way, that's kind of like public comment, right? But it's like more, I guess, surrendered, you know, intentionally.
Yeah.
So what were you surprised by, Lakelyn or Dr. Beaver, with what you found? What was surprising?
You can go ahead first, Dr. Beaver, if you want to.
Surprising was how richly encoded in law the ability to public comment is, right? So since the early 1940s, mid 1940s, it's been federal law that almost every agency must take public comment on public policy issues. And that comes in various different forms. It's left to the agency to decide what that looks like. But the history was the other thing I found fascinating. And there's really, okay, so there's a lot of things I found fascinating, obviously. They're all connected. One of those is the history. The second is how little the history has been looked at from an academic scholarly perspective. There's really just one dude who got worried about this and wrote a few papers and then went on to other things. And I say dude, not technically like he was a male scholar, but whatever. Dude as in a scholar, because I can't use words. Sorry. Yeah, what I found interesting was that it was encoded in law, but then there's been such a radical shift in the way that works. So it used to be, you had to like sit down and write a letter on paper and mail it in to the agency. And they would like read it and correlate it and take notes on it, and that would inform policy. And then, Nikki, you were even more right that only those who had time, so those with privilege, right, could engage in public policy. And now, since the, like in the early 90s maybe, or even a little earlier than that perhaps, there was a digital option for e-commenting. You could start to do this, and public agencies were like, well, crap, like I guess we should do that, but we don't really know how or under what constraints or why. And so every agency does this a little bit differently, but the common rule case I found fascinating because there are zero checks. I mean, we did all this research for the first paper I did over the summer, and we read about how federal regulators used these comments to radically shift their perspective, as Lakelyn said. We could talk a little bit more about that process specifically. But then I wrote to them afterwards. I wrote to regulators after we published this paper, and I was like, hey, I was just thinking, like, can I get a list of IP addresses from the commenters? And they were like, oh, we don't track that. And I was like, well, how can you verify that users are who they say they are? And they were like, oh, we can't. And then I was like, yeah, but do y'all remember like the net neutrality thing that happened? Like that was only 10 years ago, right? Less than that. In that instance, 1.5 million public comments were later found to be fraudulent. Like entire governments tried to shift our policy in the United States around net neutrality. And there were no, I mean, there were no repercussions. It's not like federal agencies said, ooh, yeah, we got to remember that one and like change the way we do business. No, they were just like, I don't know, internet, it's hard. Like, and that all drives me nuts. And you can tell, sorry, I'm getting a little worked up, but this project with Lakelyn came only about a year after we finished our book in digital ethics, where I'd done a lot of thinking about the things you were talking about, Nikki, the way that like the speed and scope of information flows radically transform the way we relate to one another, radically reshape policy norms. We know that every corporation in the world is using every bit of data it can with the fewest amount of constraints made legal to shape the way they do business. This is Google and Amazon's and Facebook's modus operandi, right? This is the why they're multi-trillion-dollar corporations in the case of Amazon. And that all bugs me a little bit, but now I'm just talking. Sorry, I answered your question and kept talking. Gotta stop that. Lakelyn, go ahead.
No, you're fine. I mean, I found similar things interesting, but also, Nikki, this attends a little bit to what you were saying earlier. I was, at one point in the communication article, took a little bit more of a critical lens to what was going on and said, you know, we have to think about who, even if it's not lobbyists or big businesses posing as individuals or, you know, posting things anonymously, even if it is like your everyday citizens who are commenting on these things, who are these citizens, right? Like what are, and do they represent the population that really needs to be represented, right? And that was a big issue for me, because if we think about those who do have the privilege, the power, and the access and the availability to engage in these comments, it's not typically your oppressed or minoritized groups. And they can be the highest populations at stake when we talk about things like bioethics, and we talk about policies that have to do with healthcare and just really everything, right? And so to me, it was interesting that there was almost like this lackadaisical like neglect of the voices behind the comments, because I think, you know, from an ethical perspective, I think the impetus is on us to ask ourselves, you know, and I think that this is what we have to do as social science researchers too, right? Like when we go to measure a research question or a hypothesis or whatever, we have to make sure that the participants we're getting actually are representative of the population that we want to measure, right? And I think the same thing applies here. So that to me was just a really interesting aspect of this whole situation, in addition to pretty much everything that Dr. Bieber said in his remarks.
I typed it, but I'll say it here for posterity. Yeah, that's really well said, Lakelyn. Like the idea that bioethical issues apply non-uniformly is so important. And you were talking about ways that the work we were doing can apply in other contexts. And I was just thinking, as you were talking about the vaccine development debates that are going on right now, right? There's a huge push to try to get a representative sample, whatever that means, of participants in trials. And that historically has been really, really difficult. And so there's the sort of questions we have about the way policy is built and the way the public engages in policy, more importantly, can apply all over the place. Yeah.
That was a great question though, Nikki. Does anybody else have any questions, comments, sarcasms?
No, so yeah, I'm trying to make things concise because I'm not a techie guy at all. So you're kind of looking at content and participation for comments on public policy. Is that what we're looking at, and trying to make sure that the participation is genuine versus somebody just like sitting back and hammering away with a lot of comments for their own agenda? Is that kind of what the gist of it is? Okay, well, so I was just thinking about some work that two different, I guess they're behavioral economics guys. One has a Nobel Prize, and I was just thinking that when you try to get participation from people, for instance, and I talked over and over to my family and stuff about the organ donor participation, and they found that countries in Europe that have a high participation, it's because you have to check a box to opt out, so you're donating your organs. Countries like the United States that have low participation are countries where you have to check a box to opt in. And that's just a very simple example. So when you're asking for participation in a public policy setting, or, you know, and like you were saying, there were vulnerable populations that are not expressing themselves and will likely, via whatever these theoretical economic behavioralists talk about, is people just are reluctant to get involved, period. They don't want to check the boxes or put up a post, yet you'll have some people that just sit on the internet and fire away. They just, I think they live for that type of thing. So that's going to be a really, I could see a very challenging expression of participants to get involved based on what those gentlemen have. They gave an example of a physician who was about to they asked physicians that were about to send patients off for hip surgery. And they said, if there's one drug, a new drug presented, would you still send the patient off for hip surgery, or would you try the drug? The physician said, no, we'd pull the patient back. They said, what if two drugs came out? They said, no, I'm not going to try to decide between two drugs. I'll send them for surgery. So it's just, yeah, people take the easy way out and they don't check the box, apparently. But yeah, I found all that interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sterling. Your mind got me racing about connections. My mind got me racing. Your thoughts made my mind get racing. That's where I was going. Pandemicing is hard. Something Nikki said combined with something you said. So imagine this. Imagine a world in which the way that Google and Facebook and other online companies use digital information, the federal government takes that up too. So rather than asking for participation, like in this case, about how the public feels about the use of biospecimens under the common rule, so protecting them as human subjects, what if we just what if the federal government just started scraping tweets that had to do with genetic testing, or they come up with a bunch of keywords, would be like a quantitative experiment, and they just scraped of data, publicly available or not, and they empirically deduced, I guess, what the public's attitude was to the role of biospecimens under the common rule. Then they wouldn't need public participation, and all of our worries would go away, and it would be more like, it's the equivalent, I guess, Sterling, of an opt-out policy. You could write to the federal government and said, hey, don't scrape my data, right? But if I don't write that email, my data is up for grabs. And that's very much, I think that's the model that's parallel most to your example of organ donation in Europe, for instance, the opt-out policy.
The only thing I would say to that is, to play devil's advocate a little bit, is I don't know if it would completely take care of our, what we're saying is the issue, right? Because again, who is on the platforms that you're data mining, right? Because
I agree.
Oftentimes, again, the marginalized and oppressed groups that we have don't always have, especially if you're looking at low income or you know, homeless people, or, you know, they don't have access or the availability or the usage to engage in these platforms. And so I think, again, you have to look at what data are we scraping, who are we scraping it from, and do they represent the public as we sort of defined it in our paper. So I, you know, I still think that we have to be careful, because if we don't, we run the risk of perpetuating some of the same pitfalls towards those that, you know, we have to take responsibility for, as far as like what we have done to, you know, other them essentially. You know, I think we have to take responsibility for that, and whatever policy or whatever methodological approach that we take. So just to play devil's advocate, like I think like theoretically and conceptually, like yes, but also maybe no.
Yeah, I was just thinking like a lot of those underrepresented groups tend to be risk averse. And part of it is that they'll hear that their data is being accessed, and they might start getting thoughts of like, well, what if like, if my default is my data is accessed, then does that mean that the government could come in and use it for figuring out whether or not like my brother or like my dad is illegal or isn't here in the country like he's supposed to be, and like all sorts of other things. So like being automatically opted in, it can be a little scary for those groups, I think.
I work a lot in voter advocacy, and we have so much trouble getting people to register to vote, because just that phrase, register to vote, is a scary phrase, and it's unclear what it means, you know, just from the phrase, even though you need a driver's license to register to vote. So in effect, they already have the information that registering to vote would take, you know, but that these, I mean, and then that leads into a whole conversation about, you know, disenfranchisement. And I'm like, that's what disenfranchisement is. You have been disenfranchised by the vocabulary, and in addition to the historical, like, lived reality of, you know, having your houses burned down and your families threatened. So, and I'm like, it's necessary, like, because it works. So the public that's in power does not want the public that is not in power to be publicly involved. So there's a lot of box checking. I like that term that you guys are using about which boxes we're checking. And I think it's frightening, you know, those realities, and how easy and willing the people that are asking for comment, you know, dismiss what they say was unavailable or unverifiable. So yeah, I wonder what, like, if you could design the next research, like, what would the next thing be?
Oh, that's easy for me. Do you want to go, Lakelyn? Do you have an idea?
You can go first.
I mean, so this is why I love talking to people about ethics, because the way this conversation has gone is we introduced a project, and then the conversation went on a tangent about a different project, right? And I think that's really important. So there's two things going on. The first thing is this really important conversation that we didn't really sufficiently address in our project about just representation in public commenting. So how do you justly represent the public? And this has all the issues that George and Nikki and Lakelyn, you're all three talking about. That's a different project, right? The ways in which register is an opt-out. And I also have to point out that Nikki and Lakelyn, you had a moment that's going to become a meme in the future, because Nikki, you said disenfranchised by the vocabulary, and Lakelyn snapped you up. That was pretty awesome. But yeah, that's a really important project. But the one we were focused on, or I guess my ethical concern was different, because mine was, there might be special interest groups, like there were in the net neutrality debate, that want to shift public opinion, right? It didn't have to do with just representation of the public. It had to do with manipulation of public opinion, right? And that's a different project. So in my read, like, the common rule, and we did a little bit of, like, maybe I'm making too much of this when we read in the paper, but, you know, imagine you have to imagine it. We live in a world where genetic information, the stuff that biobanks are built from, so biospecimens, is worth money because it's information, right? And it's highly commercialized and highly commercializable, especially in the US, because we don't have a national biobanking system, et cetera, et cetera. But imagine there's a company in the US that's really vested, like their CEO makes Forbes magazine's cover and they're worth billions of dollars. And what they do is build drugs using publicly available, using privatized biobanks, right? That they get from public donation. And let's say the federal government wanted to shift the rule so that biospecimens were covered under the common rule. They're protected like human subjects data is. That would radically disrupt, it could radically disrupt the way that company does business. If I were the CEO of that company and there were no regulations or rules in place, I'd be like, I'm hiring a bot farm and I'm going to flood public comments and I'm going to make sure that the public is represented as not wanting that included in the public pool, which we don't have evidence of, I will say, but that is exactly what happened in the case of the common rule revisions. Regulators wanted to include biosamples. They shifted their opinion based on public input and didn't include biospecimens in the revised common rule, setting us back on my read a couple of decades, but who am I? So again, I think that's the second case. So circling back around, Nikki, to your question, like the next project I think that I would push Lakelyn to take up if she were willing would be this question of like, how in the e-commentary process do we justly represent the public? I think that's a super fascinating question.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And, I think we did talk in both of the articles about the spread of misinformation and misconceptions and things like that, which I think is a salient topic going on, in the last couple of years. We've seen the coined term fake news and things like that, right? And how does that get spread? Who spreads that? At what point in risk and crisis communication? So again, like I'm speaking from my lens and my repertoire of knowledge, which is limited, arguably, but we talk about these things too, as far as now that everyday citizens can be journalists, or social media makes knowledge dissemination and information seeking much faster. The spread of misinformation or misconceptions about things that shift the public's opinion on policies and on actions and on, just a plethora of different things is very serious. And that is something that I would like to dive into further through other modalities, or even through a more generalized sort of conceptualization of policies. So we took we made our argument and then applied it to a very specific case. But, we also talked about the international ramifications as well. So how this doesn't just apply to US-centric policies or, circumstances, that this is actually also an international phenomenon that needs to be considered as international, and other countries go through the same type of process if they do. And so I think that also would be another line to take this next, is on a more international front, because I think that that's also something that research in general, no matter what discipline it is, needs to do a little bit better of, is not remaining ethnocentric in our work, right? And not just focusing on how XYZ applies to the United States. So that's kind of where I see us heading with, kind of how these projects were set up.
See, the problem is I got to Lakelyn too late, right? She's already a communication student, so come on. But there's going to be ethics in her dissertation. I just know it. It's going to be part of what's happening there. Yeah.
Funny you should mention that, actually.
Uh-oh. Have I caused problems already? This is good. Your major professor is going to call me up and be like, listen. Okay.
No, no, never. Well, we're not even going to talk about my dissertation. We're not even going.
Sorry, no points of anxiety there. We're good. Yeah, so I am still really interested in this project, and this is the sort of thing that I would like to see become something bigger. So again, if there are interests, because there's so many connections between, Nikki, you know well now, the TNT program, there's a lot of sort of social media research happening there. And then the bioethics connection is weaker in the program, but I think still there, people worried about health and ethics. So I think there's projects like these have lots of legs. And just to step back for a minute, one of the ways that a reading group or a discussion group like this can go is to stimulate topics that can become topics of other research. So two of you could decide to work together on a project, or come to me with a grant proposal the center could help with, or there's any number of things. But yeah, the work has to start from you all and then build up. And that's what the center is supposed to do, is supposed to support student and faculty engagement in ethics across campus. So, yeah.
And that's sort of the last thing that I'll sort of talk about in relation to our projects too. I think there needs to be a little bit more looking at ethics from other methodological approaches as well. So even in communication, when there's exploration of ethics, it's more from an argumentative standpoint, sort of how Dr. Beaver and I wrote our papers, more from not necessarily like we did this research project or we collected this data and analyzed it. We took a more argumentative case study type of approach, which was appropriate and I think worked well. But also I would like to see ethics being applied in other methodological approaches and like paradigmatic understandings of ethics and how those practically apply in real world contexts. So I think that's even a further direction this all could go in.
Yeah, I was just thinking about like just Twitter within the science community, and I don't know how often like someone's posted something in response to like a quote unquote like celebrity scientist, and that person gets like tons of likes, and then I click on their profile, go to it, and it's like 0 followers, profile made this month. And it's just like really odd that like those like ghost profiles that just come out of nowhere can have so much sway on someone's opinion or when someone makes a decision. And a lot of the times it happens when people are just kind of like nonchalant. It's like, I'll just ask like the internet, and people take advantage of that. But I don't know. It's just I've gotten better. I used to be the kind of person that like I would go to the comments, like, okay, what are other people saying about this? But now I like look through. I think about like the question first, and then if there is a comment that's getting a lot of like attention, I'll click to who's potentially like giving that comment. It gets a little hazy with like the number of trolls that are out there and are like purposely being like making fake accounts and purposely posing as fake scientists. But yeah, that's kind of like where my mind was going first when you started talking about everything, just kind of within social media, within Twitter.
It's so interesting to me, George, that this is, I mean, what you're describing is sort of information literacy. Like, how do you know a good source from a bad source? Like, how do you mediate information? And I don't think this is a new problem. I mean, it's something that we've had to deal with forever. The difference you're describing, I think, is the thing that's bothered me so much. Digitized information just moves so quickly, and there's so much of it. So it's a sort of a speed and scope question that's harder to develop that skill, and it's almost overwhelming to utilize it. Like everything you look up on Google or wherever, like you have to make sure you know where it's coming. You have to understand how the algorithm's working for you differently than it works for somebody else. I mean, there's all sorts of layers to this complexity, which is why like I was grateful that Lakelyn let us focus so specifically on this one bioethics case, because it's just such an overwhelming problem to address. To give it a really specific context lets you like peel away the layers and see what's going on. But then you realize like it's just one onion in a bunch. I'm gonna get lost in metaphors here for a second. So, yeah. Okay, I wanna be respectful of everybody's time. I know in the pandemic we are Zoom bound. So we have 5 minutes left for the session. So what I wanted to do is remind us I think Marissa is going to talk with us on the 29th, which is our next session on tweets and ethics. On the 13th, George, you're up for thinking about ethics in corporate culture or whatever you decide to do. You can give us a heads up a week in advance. That'd be great. I can help spread the word. Jose, we have you down for the 27th of October talking about research ethics or any topic of your choice. Sterling, you're November 10th with religion and healthcare. And then November 24th, Dr. Kubler, who isn't here with us today, but the associate director of the center and also professor of chemistry and optics, is going to talk with us about his interests in ethics. And then December 8th is our last session for this semester, and that's wide open. But Nikki and Ayana, Ayana's gone, but Nikki and Ayana are both our new members. And if Nikki, if you want to share any work that you're doing, or if you want to have a voice this semester, we can add other topics. I mentioned when we first started these this semester, we went bi-weekly just to give us some breathing room. We've all got so much going on, but I don't think anybody would mind adding in a session, and we all just attend as we can. So this day and time we can make weekly. So the point is, Nikki, if you and others want to talk with us or share a thought or a project, we can find space for you to do that. We have only half as many potential sessions scheduled as we could. Yeah. So you can let me know about that. And the last thing I will say is I want to make sure you all know you're welcome to spread the word and invite friends to attend these sessions. They're open to the UCF community and the Orlando community broadly construed. So I'd like to see this grow and for us to all have some impact. So thank you, everybody. I'm really excited that this is working out so well. Thanks for your participation, and do stay in touch.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.